A raging storm, the kind that makes the city of San Francisco shudder under its relentless rain and fierce wind, slashing through streets and shaking the grand facades of some of the most expensive homes along Pacific Heights. The sound of thunder crashes like broken dreams. Tonight, loneliness has a name, and it echoes through marble hallways. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding laundry, or coming home from work after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. Maria Santos stood at the wrought iron gates of 2847 Pacific Avenue, her thin coat doing little to shield her from the October storm that had been battering San Francisco for 3 days straight. The mansion before her rose like a monument to wealth, 5 stories of cream-colored stone, floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected nothing but darkness, and a driveway lined with perfectly manicured hedges that seemed immune to the chaos of nature. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, clutched a worn leather purse that contained everything she owned of value: her green card, a photograph of her late sister Rosa, and $43 in crumpled bills. At 52, Maria had learned to read the language of houses. This one spoke of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, in tech stocks, real estate investments, and cryptocurrency portfolios that most people couldn't even pronounce. She had cleaned homes in Pacific Heights before, but never one that felt so much like a fortress. The silence that emanated from within was different from the quiet of empty houses. This was the silence of grief, thick and suffocating as fog rolling in from the Golden Gate. She pressed the brass doorbell, its chime echoing somewhere deep inside the mansion. Through the beveled glass, she could see the faint outline of a chandelier that probably cost more than she would earn in 5 years. Her reflection stared back at her, a small woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing her best dress shirt and black slacks that had been ironed 3 times that morning. She had learned long ago that first impressions mattered, especially for women like her. The door opened to reveal a man in his early 40s, tall and lean with the kind of sharp features that suggested both intelligence and impatience. James Harrison looked like he had stepped from the pages of Fortune magazine. Even in his grief, even in his rumpled dress shirt and day-old stubble, there was an aura of power around him that money couldn't buy, but success had certainly crafted. His eyes, a pale gray like the storm clouds outside, swept over Maria with barely concealed irritation. "You're late," he said, though they both knew the buses were running behind schedule due to the flooding on Market Street. "The storm, Mr. Harrison," Maria replied softly, her slight accent wrapping around the words like velvet. "I came as fast as I could." He stepped aside to let her in, and Maria found herself in an entryway that belonged in a museum. The floors were Italian marble, veined with gold that caught the light from a crystal chandelier hanging 30 feet above. A staircase curved upward, like something from a movie, its banister polished to mirror brightness. But despite all the beauty, despite the fortune displayed in every corner, the house felt hollow, empty, sad. "Mrs. Chen will show you around," Harrison said, already turning away. "She manages the household staff. You'll be working Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. 7:30 to 5:30. Lunch is not provided." As he spoke, an older Asian woman appeared from what Maria assumed was the kitchen. Mrs. Chen wore a crisp navy dress and an expression that suggested she had been managing wealthy households since before Maria was born. Her greeting was polite but cold, professional but distant. "Follow me," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled the invisible machinery that kept mansions running. "I'll show you your responsibilities." They walked through rooms that seemed designed for photograph shoots rather than living. The living room contained furniture that looked like it had never been sat on: white Italian leather sofas arranged around a coffee table made from a single piece of glass that probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent. The walls displayed abstract paintings that meant nothing to her but everything to art investors who understood that culture, like stocks and bonds, could be portfolios. "Mr. Harrison is very particular about privacy," Mrs. Chen explained as they moved through the dining room, where a table for 12 sat empty beneath another crystal chandelier. He rarely entertains now. Since his wife died 8 months ago, he prefers solitude. Maria nodded, understanding flowing through her like recognition. She had cleaned the homes of the grieving before. She knew the weight of loss, how it settled into furniture and walls, making even the most luxurious spaces feel like tombs. Behind them, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps, someone pacing back and forth, restless and trapped. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, granite countertops that stretched for miles, stainless steel appliances that gleamed like surgical instruments, and a breakfast nook overlooking a garden where even the rain couldn't diminish the careful arrangement of roses and lavender. But like everything else in the house, it felt unlived in. The refrigerator was nearly empty, except for takeout containers and bottles of expensive wine. The coffee maker looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. "You'll be responsible for the main floors," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Dusting, vacuuming, bathrooms, kitchen cleaning. The family rarely uses the formal dining room anymore, but Mr. Harrison insists it be maintained. There are 2 children, Emma, 16, and David, 13. They're usually at school or in their rooms. They prefer not to be disturbed." As if summoned by the mention of their names, footsteps could be heard on the stairs. Emma Harrison appeared first, a tall girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's delicate features, visible in the family portrait hanging in the hallway. She wore the uniform of teenage rebellion, ripped jeans, an oversized sweater, and an expression that suggested the world had disappointed her beyond repair. Behind her came David, younger and smaller, with the same sharp intelligence in his eyes, but none of his sister's armor. Where Emma projected defiance, David seemed to have folded in on himself. "Is this the new maid?" Emma asked, not looking at Maria but addressing Mrs. Chen as if Maria weren't there. "This is Mrs. Santos," Mrs. Chen replied with practiced diplomacy. "She'll be helping maintain the house." Emma's gaze finally found Maria, and in it Maria saw something she recognized. Pain dressed up as indifference. The girl was beautiful in the way that money could enhance but not create, with perfect teeth and skin that glowed with expensive skincare. But there were shadows under her eyes, the kind that came from crying into pillows when you thought no one could hear. "Whatever," Emma said, but her voice cracked slightly on the word. "Just don't touch my stuff." David said nothing, but when his eyes met Maria's, she saw something else. A loneliness so deep it made her chest ache. He reminded her of her nephew Miguel, back in the Mission District, who used to hide behind her skirts when the world felt too big and scary. As the children disappeared back upstairs, Mrs. Chen showed Maria the cleaning supplies, industrial-grade products stored in a utility room that was bigger than Maria's entire apartment. Everything was organized with military precision, different chemicals for different surfaces, color-coded cloths for different rooms, and equipment that looked more sophisticated than what she was used to in smaller homes. "Mr. Harrison values efficiency," Mrs. Chen said, handing Maria a checklist that was 2 pages long. "He built his fortune on precision. His company developed the cryptocurrency platform that made him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. He expects the same attention to detail in his home." Maria studied the list, noting that every task was timed to the minute. The house might have been worth $20 million, but it was run like a business. She understood now why the previous maid had quit after only 3 weeks. This wasn't just cleaning. This was performance art. Left alone to begin her work, Maria started with the living room. As she dusted the glass table, she caught sight of framed photographs that had been turned face down, images of happier times that had become too painful to look at. Gently, carefully, she turned one upright. It showed the Harrison family at what looked like a company Christmas party. James in a tuxedo, his arm around a woman with kind eyes, and Emma's smile. The children younger and unguarded, all of them radiating the confidence that came with having everything you could ever want. The woman, Catherine, she had heard Mrs. Chen call her, had died in a car accident on Highway 101, returning from a charity fundraiser in Silicon Valley. The newspapers had covered it for weeks, not because of the tragedy itself, but because of James Harrison's dramatic withdrawal from public life. Stock prices for his company had fluctuated with every rumor about his mental state. Wall Street didn't mourn the loss of love, it worried about the loss of leadership. As Maria worked, she began to understand the geography of grief in this house. James's study, which she glimpsed through an open door, was where he spent most of his time now, surrounded by financial reports, cryptocurrency charts, and half-empty bottles of bourbon that cost more per shot than she made per hour. The children's rooms, she could tell from the sounds that drifted down, had become refugees where they nursed their own wounds with music and silence. But it was the master bedroom that told the real story. When Maria finally entered it to change the sheets, she found a space frozen in time. Catherine's side of the massive walk-in closet remained untouched. Designer dresses hanging like expensive ghosts, jewelry that could have funded a small business sitting in velvet-lined boxes. The bed, easily worth more than a car, looked like it had been slept in by only one person for months. On the nightstand, a bottle of sleeping pills sat next to an investment portfolio, showing numbers that would have made most people dizzy with possibility. This was wealth without joy, success without satisfaction. Maria had cleaned modest apartments where laughter echoed from every corner, where families gathered around small tables for meals that cost less than the wine sitting unopened in Harrison's kitchen. She had learned that money could buy space but not warmth, possessions but not purpose. As the afternoon wore on and the storm continued to batter the windows, Maria found herself thinking about her own losses. Rosa, her younger sister, who had died of cancer 5 years ago in a county hospital bed. There had been no marble floors or crystal chandeliers to cushion that grief, just the raw reality of loss and the crushing weight of medical bills that had taken years to pay off. But there had also been something else: community. Neighbors who brought food, friends who sat vigil, a church full of people who understood that grief shared was grief diminished. Here in this mansion, surrounded by every comfort money could provide, the Harrison family grieved alone. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. James Harrison appeared in the doorway of the living room, having changed into jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Up close, she could see the toll the last 8 months had taken. His face was thinner, his eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. "The table," he said, pointing to the glass coffee table she had been cleaning. It was Catherine's choice. She said it made the room feel lighter. It was the first personal thing he had shared, and Maria sensed the effort it took. She nodded, understanding that grief sometimes leaked out in unexpected moments through cracks in the armor we build around our hearts. She had good taste, Maria said softly. "Everything here, it's beautiful." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, that the maid had offered an opinion. For a moment, he looked like he might say more, might crack open the door to the pain he carried. But then his phone buzzed with what was probably another urgent email about stock options or investment opportunities, and the moment passed. "Finish up in here and then you can start on the kitchen," he said, his voice returning to its earlier detachment. "Mrs. Chen will let you out when you're done." As he walked away, Maria felt the familiar ache of recognition. She had seen it before, in other wealthy homes, this assumption that the help was invisible until needed, present but not quite human. It was a loneliness of a different kind. The isolation that came from having so much power that you forgot how to connect with people who couldn't do anything for you. But as she continued her work, humming softly to herself the way she always did, Maria began to sense something else. From upstairs came the faint sound of David's voice, asking Emma about homework. From the study came the occasional rustle of papers, the clink of ice in a glass. The house wasn't dead, it was just sleeping, waiting for someone to remember how to live in it again. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the thunder moving farther out over the Pacific. Inside, Maria worked steadily, her presence as quiet and constant as rainfall. She didn't know yet that in the months to come, she would become more than just the woman who cleaned this house. She didn't know that her gentle strength would slowly crack open doors that grief had sealed shut, or that her own story of loss and resilience would become a mirror in which the Harrison family would see themselves clearly for the first time in months. All she knew was that tomorrow she would return, and the day after that, bringing with her the same quiet dignity that had carried her through her own storms. In a house full of expensive things, she would offer the one gift that money couldn't buy: the understanding that shared humanity is what makes any space, no matter how grand, finally feel like home. As the evening light faded over San Francisco, casting long shadows across Pacific Heights, Maria finished her first day in the Harrison mansion. Mrs. Chen inspected her work with professional thoroughness, nodding with what might have been the beginning of approval. The hardwood floors gleamed, the granite counters shone, and the air carried the faint scent of lemon polish and dignity preserved. 3 days later, Maria returned to find the house subtly different. The storm had passed, but a new kind of weather was building inside these walls. Emma sat at the breakfast nook, stabbing at a bowl of cereal with the intensity of someone fighting a much larger battle. Her school uniform was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair arranged in the effortless style that took considerable effort to achieve. But her eyes held the puffy exhaustion of another sleepless night. "The coffee maker's broken," Emma announced to no one in particular as Maria entered the kitchen. "It's been making this weird noise for 3 days, but nobody cares enough to fix it." Maria studied the expensive machine, its digital display flashing error codes like a distress signal. She had worked in enough homes to recognize the difference between broken machinery and neglected maintenance. This wasn't about coffee. This was about a 16-year-old girl desperate to be heard by adults too wrapped in their own grief to notice her drowning. "Maybe I can look at it," Maria offered, setting down her cleaning supplies. Emma glanced up, surprise flickering across her features. In the 6 months since her mother died, how many adults had offered to solve a problem rather than dismiss it? Maria began examining the machine with the methodical patience of someone who had learned to fix things because calling repair services was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You don't have to," Emma said, but she didn't look away. "My coffee maker at home does this sometimes," Maria replied, locating the small reset button hidden behind the water reservoir. "Too much mineral buildup from the water. San Francisco water is hard on machines." As the coffee maker hummed back to life, Emma's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching wonder. It was such a small victory, but in a house where nothing had felt fixable for months, small victories carried outsized meaning. "How did you know how to do that?" Emma asked. "Practice," Maria smiled. "When you can't afford to replace things, you learn to repair them." The comment hung in the air between them, not accusatory, just factual. Emma had never lived in a world where broken things stayed broken, where problems persisted because solutions cost money you didn't have. For the first time in months, she was curious about someone else's experience rather than consumed by her own pain. David appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of conversation in the kitchen. At 13, he moved through the house like a ghost, trying to take up as little space as possible. His backpack hung from thin shoulders that seemed to carry more than just textbooks, and his eyes held the wariness of a child who had learned that adults could disappear without warning. "Is the coffee working?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Santos fixed it," Emma said, and there was something in her tone that Maria hadn't heard before, a note of respect, perhaps even gratitude. As Maria prepared to begin her cleaning routine, she noticed David lingering near the kitchen island. He had opened his math homework, but wasn't looking at it, instead stealing glances at her as she organized her supplies. Finally, he cleared his throat. "My mom used to make coffee here every morning," he said, the words coming out in a rush. She would hum while she waited for it to brew. She always made extra in case Dad wanted some later, but he usually grabbed Starbucks on his way to work anyway. It was the most Maria had heard him speak, and the confidence in his voice suggested he had been storing up these memories, waiting for someone safe enough to share them with. Emma looked at her brother with new attention, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time in months. "She used to let me add the cream," David continued. "She said it was the most important part, getting the color just right." Maria nodded, understanding that he wasn't really talking about coffee. He was talking about ritual, about connection, about the small daily ceremonies that make a house feel alive. She had learned, in her years of cleaning other people's homes, that children often held on to these details when adults let them slip away. "What songs did she hum?" Maria asked gently. "Old ones," David said, a smile threatening the corners of his mouth. "Mom was always behind the times with music. She liked things from when she was young. Beatles, Carole King, songs that Emma said were ancient." "They weren't ancient," Emma protested, but without her usual edge. "They were just classic." As the days passed, Maria began to understand the rhythm of grief in the Harrison household. James spent most of his time in his study, managing investments and cryptocurrency portfolios that continued to grow even as his family life contracted. She would catch glimpses of him on video calls, discussing market volatility and profit margins with the same intensity he had once brought to dinner conversations with his wife. The house's monthly expenses, property taxes, utilities, staff salaries, were managed through automated systems that ensured money flowed without requiring human oversight. Everything was efficient except happiness. But something was beginning to shift in the spaces where Maria worked. She had a way of humming while she cleaned, old songs in Spanish that her grandmother had taught her, melodies that seemed to fill corners where silence had gathered too long. When she dusted the piano in the living room, a baby grand that hadn't been played since Catherine's death, her fingers would sometimes pick out simple tunes, muscle memory from piano lessons her mother had scraped together money for when Maria was 8. Emma, home early from school one Wednesday, stood in the doorway listening as Maria played a halting version of Yesterday. The song was full of gaps and hesitation, clearly the work of someone whose classical training had been interrupted by practical necessities, but there was something honestly beautiful about it. "Mom loved that song," Emma said when Maria finished. "It's a good song for missing someone," Maria replied. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon light streaming through windows that Maria had cleaned until they sparkled. The house felt different when music lived in it, even imperfect music played by cleaning worn hands. "Do you miss people too?" Emma asked, and Maria heard in the question everything the girl couldn't say directly. "Do you understand what this feels like? Am I alone in this? Will it ever stop hurting? My sister Rosa died 5 years ago," Maria said simply. "Cancer. She was 43, had 2 little girls." Emma sank into one of the white leather chairs, suddenly looking much younger than 16. "What happened to them? The little girls?" "They live with their father now, in Sacramento. I see them sometimes when I can afford the bus ticket. They're growing up too fast, the way children do when they lose their mothers." The weight of shared experience settled between them, connecting 2 women separated by decades and social class, but united by the understanding that loss speaks the same language, regardless of zip code. Emma had never met anyone who talked about death without trying to make it prettier or more meaningful than it was. "People keep telling me that Mom is in a better place," Emma said, "but I don't want her to be in a better place. I want her to be here, complaining about my grades and making Dad take family vacations he doesn't want to go on." Maria nodded, recognizing the anger that lived underneath Emma's grief. Anger at God, at fate, at well-meaning adults who offered clichés instead of comfort. "Your mother would want to be here too," she said. "Missing you is probably the hardest part of wherever she is now." It was a different kind of comfort than Emma was used to receiving, one that honored her pain rather than trying to minimize it. For the first time since the accident, someone had suggested that her grief was proportional to her love, that the depth of her sorrow was a testament to what had been lost, rather than a problem to be solved. That evening, as Maria prepared to leave, she found David in the kitchen again. this time attempting to make himself a sandwich. The process was clearly challenging for him. The bread was torn from too much pressure, and he had managed to get peanut butter on both the counter and his school shirt. "Here," Maria said gently, taking over with the practiced efficiency of someone who had raised children on limited resources. "Soft pressure on the bread. The knife spreads better when it's slightly warm." She ran warm water over the blade, showing him how to glide it smoothly across the surface. Such a small thing, making a sandwich, but David watched with the intensity of a student learning crucial life skills. "Mom used to do this," he said. "She made our lunches every morning, even though we could afford for us to buy food at school. Said homemade was better." "She was right," Maria replied. "Food made with love tastes different." As David bit into his sandwich, she noticed him close his eyes briefly, as if trying to taste the difference between sustenance and care. These were the moments Maria had learned to treasure in her work, not the obvious victories, but the quiet instances when healing happened through attention to the smallest details. The revelation came the following Friday, when Maria arrived to find Mrs. Chen waiting with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal disappointment. In the weeks since Maria had started working at the Harrison house, the older woman had begun to thaw slightly, offering occasional nods of approval and even some practical advice about navigating the family's particular needs. "There's been a problem," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "Mr. Harrison's Rolex is missing from his bedroom, the one that belonged to his grandfather, worth about $40,000. Maria felt the familiar chill that came with accusations, the way the air seemed to thin when suspicion entered a room where she was the most obvious target. She had been through this before, in other wealthy homes where the help was automatically scrutinized when valuable items went missing. "When was it last seen?" Maria asked calmly. 3 days ago. Mr. Harrison noticed it was gone from his nightstand yesterday evening. You were the only service person in the master bedroom this week." The words hung between them, professional but pointed. Maria understood the mathematics of suspicion in houses like this one. Expensive object plus missing item plus cleaning lady equaled an equation that rarely worked in her favor. She had learned long ago not to take these accusations personally, but that didn't make them sting less. "I can show you my bag," Maria offered, though they both knew that if she had taken the watch, she wouldn't still be carrying it. "I can give you my address, phone number, anything you need." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly at Maria's calm response, but professionalism demanded that she follow protocol. "Mr. Harrison wants to speak with you directly." James Harrison waited in his study, surrounded by the tools of his trade, multiple computer monitors displaying real-time cryptocurrency values, printed reports on venture capital investments, and financial journals stacked like fortress walls around his desk. His fortune, built on digital innovation and strategic risk-taking, continued to generate wealth even as his personal life fell apart. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. Here was a man who could track millions of dollars in assets across global markets but couldn't keep track of a watch in his own bedroom. "Sit down," he said, not looking up from a report on Bitcoin mining operations. Maria remained standing, understanding that this wasn't really about the watch. In the weeks she had worked here, she had seen how grief had transformed James Harrison from a leader into someone desperately trying to control whatever he could still manage. The missing watch wasn't just a financial loss. It was another reminder that his world was slipping beyond his ability to protect it. "The watch has significant sentimental value," he said finally, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to sound reasonable while fighting fear. "It belonged to my grandfather, who built the first iteration of what became our family's real estate portfolio. My father wore it when he took the company public. I wore it on my wedding day." Each detail added weight to the accusation, transforming a simple piece of jewelry into a symbol of legacy and connection. Maria understood now why this mattered so much. In losing Catherine, James had already lost the future he had planned. The watch represented the past, the foundation on which everything else had been built. "I understand it's important," Maria said quietly. "I didn't take it. The security system, shows that you were alone in the bedroom for approximately 20 minutes on Wednesday, James continued, consulting what appeared to be a detailed timeline. The cleaning service used before you started was bonded and insured. I should have required the same from you. The words hit like small stones, each one carrying the weight of assumption and class prejudice. Maria had heard variations of this speech before. We trusted you. We let you into our home. How could you betray that trust? The subtext was always the same. People like you can't be relied upon. People like you will always disappoint us. People like you are fundamentally different from people like us. I've been cleaning houses for 12 years, Maria said, her voice steady despite the hurt building in her chest. I've never taken anything that didn't belong to me. I won't start now. James finally looked up from his reports, and Maria saw something in his eyes that was worse than anger. Disappointment mixed with a kind of tired resignation, as if he had expected this outcome and was almost relieved to have his low expectations confirmed. I'm going to have to let you go, he said. Mrs. Chen will give you payment for the hours you've worked. I'd prefer not to involve the police, but I will if the watch doesn't turn up. The threat hung in the air between them, professional but devastating. Maria understood the power dynamics at play here, her word against his, her need for income against his ability to make accusations that could follow her to other jobs. She also understood something else. James Harrison wasn't really angry about the watch. He was angry about everything he couldn't control, and she was the convenient target for rage that had no other outlet. I understand, Maria said, because sometimes dignity required accepting injustice rather than fighting battles you were destined to lose. As she gathered her supplies for the last time, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. The teenager's school uniform was wrinkled, her face puffy from another night of tears. But her expression was sharp with intelligence and anger. I heard Dad yelling, Emma said. Are you leaving? Yes, mija, Maria replied gently. Your father thinks it's best. Emma's eyes narrowed with the kind of fury that only adolescence can summon in the face of adult injustice. This is about the stupid watch, isn't it? He's blaming you because it's easier than admitting he can't keep track of his own things. The insight was startling in its accuracy. At 16, Emma Harrison had already learned to read the psychology of grief, to understand how pain could transform reasonable people into something smaller and more afraid. She had watched her father retreat from emotional risk into the safer territory of control and suspicion. Sometimes people need someone to blame, Maria said, shouldering her bag with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every other injustice in her life. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. David appeared beside his sister, and Maria saw in his face the same devastation she recognized from her own childhood. The look of a child who had learned that adults could be arbitrary and unfair, that safety was always temporary. I don't want you to go, he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. Maria knelt down to his level, seeing in his eyes the same fear that had driven his father's accusations. David had already lost his mother. Now he was losing the one adult who had been consistently kind to him, who had fixed his sandwich and listened to his stories about coffee rituals and Beatles songs. You're going to be okay, she told him, meaning it. You and Emma, you're stronger than you know. And your father. He's hurting right now, but he loves you. Sometimes love gets confused with fear, but it's still love. She hugged David briefly, feeling his thin shoulders shake with suppressed tears. Emma stood beside them, her face a mask of anger and helplessness, emotions that would take years to fully process and understand. As Maria walked toward the front door, she passed the living room where the glass coffee table gleamed with her careful attention, where the piano sat ready to fill the house with music again if anyone remembered how to play. The family portrait on the mantel showed Catherine Harrison smiling beside her husband and children, all of them unaware that happiness could be so fragile. Mrs. Chen waited by the entrance with an envelope containing Maria's final payment. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, but Maria caught a flicker of something that might have been apology or respect. "I'm sorry it ended this way," Mrs. Chen said quietly. Maria nodded, understanding that Mrs. Chen was caught between loyalty to her employer and recognition of injustice. They were both working women in a world where their opinions mattered less than their efficiency, where their humanity was secondary to their function. "Take care of them," Maria said, meaning the children. The heavy front door closed behind her with the finality of judgment rendered. Outside, San Francisco sparkled in afternoon sunshine, the storm-washed streets reflecting light like promises of better days ahead. Pacific Heights spread out below her, a neighborhood of beautiful homes where beautiful families lived carefully curated lives that money could protect from most troubles, but not from the universal experiences of loss and longing. Maria walked to the bus stop on Fillmore Street, where she would catch the 22 line back to her apartment in the Mission District. Around her, the city hummed with the energy of 800,000 people pursuing their own versions of happiness and security. She was just one middle-aged Latina woman carrying a bag of cleaning supplies, invisible to most passers-by but carrying within herself the same hopes and dreams that had built this city from gold rush ambition and immigrant determination. As the bus arrived, crowded with other working people heading home at the end of another day, Maria found a seat near the window and watched Pacific Heights recede behind her. Somewhere in that mansion, James Harrison was probably checking his portfolio again, watching numbers that represented security accumulate while his children ate dinner alone. Somewhere in those pristine rooms, Emma was fighting tears over homework she couldn't concentrate on, and David was making another sandwich without understanding why it didn't taste like love anymore. Maria had been dismissed from jobs before, would probably be dismissed from others in the future, but this time felt different, weighted with possibilities that had been cut short before they could fully develop. For a few weeks, she had watched a family begin to heal, had seen music return to silent rooms and conversation replace isolation. Now that progress would have to continue without her, if it continued at all. 3 weeks passed. Maria found work with another family in Noe Valley, people who appreciated her reliability and didn't question her references. The new job was easier in some ways, less prestigious, fewer expensive objects to navigate around, employers who treated her with basic respect, but it lacked the emotional complexity that had made the Harrison house feel like more than just work. Meanwhile, 25 blocks away in Pacific Heights, the Harrison mansion had returned to its former silence. Mrs. Chen managed the household with her usual efficiency, but she noticed things. Emma's grades slipping further. David spending entire afternoons hiding in his room. James working even longer hours as if financial success could fill the emotional void that continued to grow. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning when Emma, desperate to procrastinate on a history paper, decided to clean her room, something she hadn't done since before her mother's death. Behind her dresser, wedged between furniture and wall in a space so narrow it was almost invisible, she found it. Her father's Rolex, its weight solid and familiar in her palm. Memory came flooding back. The night of the thunderstorm 3 weeks ago, she had been unable to sleep, wandering the house like a ghost, haunting her own life. She had gone into her parents' bedroom, something that usually felt too painful to bear, and had picked up the watch from her father's nightstand. It had seemed important somehow, a physical connection to the man her father had been, before grief transformed him into someone she barely recognized. She had meant to put it back, but the storm had sent her running to her own room, and the watch had somehow gotten swept behind her dresser in the chaos of emotional overwhelm. Emma stood holding the watch, understanding immediately what its absence had cost. Maria Santos, kind, patient Maria, who had fixed coffee makers and played piano and listened to David's stories, had been fired because of this. Her father, in his desperate need to control something in a life that felt completely out of control, had chosen to believe the worst rather than look for other explanations. The weight in her hand was more than gold and platinum. It was the weight of injustice compounded, of assumptions made and dignity destroyed. Emma had watched adults make decisions that hurt innocent people but she had never been directly responsible for such damage before. She found her father in his study, surrounded by the familiar fortress of financial reports and market analysis. James Harrison looked older than his 42 years, worn down by grief and the exhausting effort of trying to manage loss like a business problem. His cryptocurrency investments were performing well, his stock portfolio robust, his real estate appreciations steady. On paper, he was becoming wealthier by the day. In reality, he was becoming poorer in every way that mattered. "Dad," Emma said, holding out the watch. James looked up from a report on blockchain technology, his eyes taking a moment to focus on something other than profit margins and investment strategies. When he saw the Rolex in his daughter's hand, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like physical pain. "Where did you find it?" he asked quietly. "In my room, behind my dresser. I took it that night during the storm when I couldn't sleep. I was in your bedroom and I needed something that felt like you used to feel. On it before." Emma's voice grew smaller as she spoke, the weight of confession and consequence settling over her. She was 16 years old enough to understand that mistakes could have permanent effects, that some damage couldn't be undone with simple apologies. James took the watch from her, his fingers closing around the familiar weight. His grandfather had worn it while building a small family business into a significant real estate portfolio. His father had worn it while navigating the company through recession and expansion. James himself had worn it on the day he married Catherine, when the future had seemed as solid and reliable as Swiss engineering. "I fired her," he said, the words coming out hollow with realization. "I accused her of stealing, and I fired her." "I know." Emma sat in the leather chair across from his desk, looking suddenly much older than her 16 years. She didn't defend herself, she just accepted it and left. The implications hit James like a series of blows. Maria Santos had been wrongly accused, had lost income she probably needed desperately, had been dismissed from a job where she was finally making a difference, and she had borne it with dignity rather than fight back, understanding perhaps that her word would carry no weight against his assumptions. "Oh God," James said, putting his head in his hands, "what have I done?" For the first time in months, Emma saw her father not as the distant, controlling figure he had become, but as the man who had once been her hero, someone capable of both great love and great mistakes. His grief had made him smaller, more afraid, quicker to see threats than possibilities. But underneath the defensive armor, he was still the person who had taught her to think critically, to question assumptions, to treat people with fairness. "You were scared," Emma said, offering understanding she had learned from Maria's example. "When Mom died, you got scared of losing anything else." "But Dad, Maria wasn't trying to take anything from us. She was trying to give us something." The truth of it settled between them, heavy with recognition. In the weeks Maria had worked in their house, something had shifted. Emma had begun sleeping better. David had started eating meals at home instead of hiding with snacks in his room, and even James had found himself looking forward to the sounds of gentle activity that meant someone was caring for their space. "She made the house feel alive again," Emma continued. "When she hummed while she worked, when she played the piano, when she talked to David about Mom. She wasn't trying to replace Mom. She was just reminding us that we could still live here, that we could still be a family." James nodded, understanding flooding through him like ice water. He had built his fortune on pattern recognition, on seeing connections that others missed, on understanding human behavior well enough to predict market trends. But grief had clouded his judgment, made him reactive rather than analytical. He had seen threat where there was only kindness, suspected theft where there was only service. "I have to find her," he said. "I have to apologize." "More than apologize," Emma said firmly. "You have to make it right." That afternoon, James Harrison did something he hadn't done in months. He left his study before dark, ignored the constant stream of emails about cryptocurrency fluctuations and investment opportunities, and drove his Tesla through San Francisco streets toward the Mission District. He had Maria's address from her employment paperwork, but as he navigated through neighborhoods where his wealth would have seemed as foreign as another planet, he began to understand how different their worlds really were. Maria's apartment building was a modest 3-story structure on 24th Street, wedged between a taqueria and a laundromat. The rent she paid for her 1-bedroom unit was probably less than what James spent monthly on his car payment, but the streets around it hummed with life in a way that Pacific Heights never did. Children played soccer on small patches of concrete, families gathered on front steps to share meals, and elderly men played dominoes beneath murals that told stories of immigration, struggle, and community survival. When Maria opened her door, she looked exactly as she had 3 weeks ago, tired but dignified, wearing clothes that were clean and carefully maintained but clearly not expensive. Behind her, James could see a small living space made warm by family photographs, religious candles, and furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than style. "Mr. Harrison," she said, surprise flickering across her face, but no anger. Even now, even after the injustice she had suffered, her first instinct was courtesy. "I found the watch," James said without preamble. "It was in Emma's room. She had taken it the night of the storm. You didn't steal anything. I was wrong to accuse you." Maria nodded, accepting the information without vindication or bitterness. She had known she was innocent. Having that innocence acknowledged changed nothing about the weeks of lost income or the damage to her reputation. "I'm glad you found it," she said simply. Her grace under pressure was more devastating than anger would have been. James had prepared himself for justified fury, for demands for apology and compensation. Instead, he was confronted with the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought or taught. The quiet strength of someone who had learned to endure injustice without becoming bitter. "I want you to come back," James said, "not just to work for us, but to help us remember how to be a family again." Maria studied his face, seeing the man behind the grief clearly for the first time. James Harrison wasn't cruel or classist by nature. He was wounded and afraid, trying to protect what remained of his family by controlling every variable he could identify. The loss of his wife had made him desperate to prevent any further loss, even at the cost of pushing away the very people who might help heal the wounds grief had left behind. "Your children are hurting," Maria said gently. "Emma is angry at the world for taking her mother, and David is afraid that if he needs anyone too much, they might disappear too. They need stability, but they also need permission to feel everything they're feeling." "I know," James said, and for the first time in months he sounded like the man who had once been confident enough to take his company public, wise enough to navigate complex business relationships, caring enough to build a life with someone he loved. "I've been so afraid of losing them that I forgot how to be present with them. Fear makes us do things that push away the very connections we're trying to protect," Maria said, speaking from experience that included far more loss than James had yet faced. "But love makes us brave enough to stay open, even when staying open hurts." They stood in her doorway for a moment, the city bustling around them with the energy of working people heading home, families gathering for dinner, communities maintaining themselves through the simple acts of daily care. Maria had learned to find meaning in small things: a perfectly cleaned surface, a well-prepared meal, the satisfaction of work completed with attention, and pride. James had forgotten those lessons in his pursuit of larger victories, grander achievements, more significant numbers in his portfolio. "Will you come back?" he asked again, and this time the question carried vulnerability rather than demand. Not as an employee, but as, I don't know what to call it, a friend, maybe. Someone who understands that healing takes time. Maria looked past him to where his expensive car was parked among the modest vehicles of her neighbors. The contrast was stark, but not insurmountable. She had learned, in her years of working in homes across the economic spectrum, that grief spoke the same language regardless of bank account balances, that children needed the same kinds of attention whether they went to private school or community college, that families succeeded or failed based on love and commitment rather than stock options and real estate investments. "I'll come back," she said, "but things will be different this time." "Different how?" "I'm not just the maid," Maria said quietly. "I'm the person who sees what everyone else is too busy or too hurt to notice. I'm the one who remembers to buy groceries that David likes, who notices when Emma has been crying, who makes sure there are fresh flowers in the house even when it feels like nothing will ever be beautiful again. If I come back, it's as someone whose voice matters, whose observations are trusted, whose presence is valued for more than just the work my hands can do." James nodded, understanding that he was being offered a gift far more valuable than any service contract. Maria Santos was proposing to return not as his employee, but as his teacher, someone who could remind his family how to live with purpose and connection, rather than just accumulating wealth and avoiding pain. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what we need." 6 months later, the Harrison mansion had transformed in ways that couldn't be measured by any investment algorithm. The changes weren't dramatic or expensive. There were no major renovations, no new furniture, no costly redecorations. Instead, the house had been returned to life through attention to details that money couldn't buy but love could provide. The kitchen had become the heart of the home again. David now made his own lunches, but under Maria's gentle guidance, learning to fold sandwich wraps properly and pack fruit that wouldn't get bruised in his backpack. Emma had taken over dinner responsibilities twice a week, discovering that she enjoyed cooking when it was framed as care rather than chore. Even James had begun eating breakfast at the island rather than grabbing coffee on his way out, understanding finally that the few minutes of morning conversation were worth more than the extra time he could spend reviewing overnight cryptocurrency market movements. The piano in the living room was being played again, haltingly at first, as Emma remembered lessons she had abandoned after her mother's death, but with growing confidence as she realized that music could be a way of honoring memory rather than avoiding it. Maria would sometimes join her for simple duets, their four hands moving across keys that had been silent too long. Most remarkably, the house had sounds again, laughter from the kitchen when David told jokes he had learned at school. The gentle hum of Maria's work songs, now joined occasionally by Emma's voice as she learned Spanish phrases and Mexican folk tunes. Even the deeper notes of James's voice, asking questions about everyone's day, making observations about small changes in routine or mood. James had rearranged his work schedule to be present for dinner 3 nights a week, a decision that had initially sent his crypto investment partners into minor panic until they realized that his reduced but more focused work hours were actually improving his decision-making. Distance from constant market monitoring had restored his ability to see larger patterns, to make strategic choices instead of reactive ones. "The best investors," he told Maria one evening as she prepared to leave, "know when to step back and let their decisions mature. I forgot that families need the same kind of patient attention." Maria was packing her bag, not the desperate gathering of cleaning supplies she had done the day she was fired, but the comfortable routine of someone whose work held meaning and whose presence was valued. Over the months, her role had evolved into something entirely new, part housekeeper, part family counselor, part cultural bridge between James's privileged isolation and the broader community where she lived. "Señor Harrison," she said, using the Spanish title that had become natural between them, "you didn't forget how to be a good father. You just forgot how to trust yourself to be one." It was the kind of gentle insight that had made Maria indispensable to the family's healing. She saw through the defensive patterns that grief had created, recognizing the love that continued to exist beneath fear and confusion. Her own experiences with loss had taught her that healing wasn't about returning to the way things were before, but about building something new that honored what had been loved and lost. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over her shoulder and car keys in hand. At 17 now, she was preparing for her senior year of high school, and the change in her was remarkable. The angry, withdrawn girl who had stabbed at her cereal that first morning had grown into someone who could hold both grief and gratitude, who understood that missing her mother would always be part of loving her. "I'm going to pick up David from soccer practice," Emma announced. "Do we need anything from the store while I'm out?" The question was simple, but it represented a fundamental shift in family dynamics. Emma now thought in terms of "we," considered the needs of the household as a whole, contributed to the daily maintenance of their shared life. She had learned, through Maria's example, that taking care of others was not burden, but privilege. "Milk?" Maria said. "And those apples David likes for his lunch. The Honey-Crisp ones." Emma nodded. "I know." As Emma left, Maria and James found themselves alone in the kitchen, a space that had once felt like the coldest room in the house, but now radiated warmth from years of shared meals and conversations. James was reviewing some financial reports, but not with the desperate intensity he had shown during those first months of widowhood. His investment portfolio continued to grow. His cryptocurrency holdings remained robust, but he had learned to measure success in broader terms. "Maria," James said, looking up from his papers, "I need to ask you something." She turned from the counter, where she had been organizing tomorrow's cleaning supplies, giving him her full attention in the way that had become characteristic of their relationship. Maria had taught them all the gift of presence, of actually listening rather than just waiting for your turn to speak. "When I fired you," James continued, his voice carrying the weight of a confession he needed to make fully, "you could have fought back. You could have demanded to search the house, insisted on your innocence, threatened to sue for wrongful termination. You had every right to be angry, but you just accepted it. Why?" Maria considered the question, understanding that James was really asking something deeper. How do you maintain dignity when dignity is under attack? How do you respond to injustice without becoming bitter? How do you keep loving people even when they hurt you? "Because anger would have changed me," she said finally. "And I spent too many years becoming the person I am to let someone else's fear make me into someone else." She moved to the kitchen island, settling onto the stool across from where James sat with his financial reports. Between them lay the evidence of two very different relationships with money and security. James's portfolios representing wealth beyond most people's imagination, Maria's simple presence representing a kind of richness that couldn't be deposited in banks. "My sister Rosa used to say that the world will break your heart whether you let it or not," Maria continued. "But if you let it make you hard, then the world wins twice. Once by hurting you, and again by taking away who you were before you got hurt." James nodded, recognizing truth when he heard it. In the months since Maria had returned, he had watched her navigate countless small challenges with the same grace she had shown during the crisis that cost her job. When David struggled with math homework, she helped without making him feel stupid. When Emma came home from school upset about friend drama, Maria listened without offering solutions unless they were requested. When James himself had bad days, when grief hit unexpectedly, triggered by a song or a scent or a memory, Maria simply maintained the steady presence that reminded him he wasn't facing it alone. "I built my fortune by identifying patterns, James said. By understanding how human behavior affects market values, how fear and greed drive investment decisions. But I never learned to recognize the pattern of my own emotions, how my grief was affecting my judgment." "Grief isn't logical like cryptocurrency," Maria replied gently. "It doesn't follow market rules. Some days you think you're doing better, and then you smell your wife's perfume on someone passing by, and you're right back at the beginning." The observation was so accurate that James felt his chest tighten with recognition. Catherine had worn a particular fragrance, something expensive but subtle that had become as much a part of her as her laugh or her way of humming off-key in the shower. When he occasionally caught that scent on other women, It was like receiving visits from a ghost he both wanted and feared to see. "But you learn to carry it differently," Maria continued. "At first, grief is like trying to walk while carrying a boulder. It's too heavy, and you can barely move. But eventually, if you're patient with yourself, it becomes more like carrying a photograph in your wallet. Still there, still important, but not so heavy that it stops you from living." "Is that how it was with your sister?" Maria's expression grew soft with memory. "Rosa was my baby sister, but she was also my best friend. When she got sick, I spent 2 years watching her die slowly, piece by piece. After she was gone, I couldn't understand how the world just kept going. Buses still ran, people still went to work, television shows still came on every night. How could everything be normal when the most important person in my life was gone?" She paused, looking out the window where the early evening light was beginning to fade over Pacific Heights. "But then her daughters needed someone to help them with homework, and my neighbors still needed someone to clean their houses, and life just insisted. Not because Rosa didn't matter, but because the love we shared was supposed to keep growing, keep making a difference in the world." James followed her gaze to the window, seeing his neighborhood with different eyes. The elegant homes of Pacific Heights represented more than wealth now. They represented families like his own, people trying to navigate loss and love, security and connection. Maria had taught him to see beyond the financial metrics that had once defined his world, beyond property values and investment returns to the human stories that gave those numbers meaning. The front door opened, interrupting his thoughts, and Emma's voice echoed through the house, no longer the bitter, angry sound it had been for so many months, but something bright and alive. "We're home!" she called. "And David scored 3 goals!" David burst into the kitchen, still wearing his soccer uniform and glowing with pride. At 14, he was beginning to show signs of the man he would become. James's sharp intelligence combined with Catherine's easy warmth, but tempered by the emotional wisdom that comes from surviving loss at a young age. "Did you see my text?" David asked his father. "I sent you a video of the second goal." "Not yet," James admitted, realizing his phone had been forgotten in his study while he talked with Maria. 6 months ago that would have been unthinkable. His phone was always within reach, always monitoring the constant stream of investment alerts and market updates. "Show me." As David pulled out his phone to replay the video, Emma grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl and settled onto the remaining stool, the kitchen filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. David narrating his soccer achievements, Emma teasing him gently about his dramatic celebrations, James watching the phone screen with the same attention he once reserved for quarterly earnings reports. Maria watched them all from her position by the counter, and her heart filled with the quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done. Not the work of cleaning and organizing, though the house ran more smoothly now than it ever had, but the deeper work of healing, of helping a broken family remember how to be whole. "Mrs. Santos," David said, looking up from his phone, "will you teach me how to make those empanadas you brought last week? Emma's always hogging them when you send them home with us." "I don't hog them," Emma protested. "I just appreciate good food when I taste it." "This weekend," Maria promised David, "we can make them together. You can help me fold the dough." It was these small promises, these gentle traditions being born, that had truly transformed the Harrison household. Maria hadn't just cleaned their home. She had helped them build a new version of family life, one that honored Catherine's memory while creating space for growth and joy. As the evening progressed and Maria prepared to head home to her apartment in the Mission District, James found himself reflecting on the changes that had occurred not just in his family but in himself. His net worth had continued to grow over the past months. Smart investments in emerging technologies, well-timed purchases of cryptocurrency, a real estate deal that had paid off handsomely. But for the first time in his adult life, he measured his success in metrics that couldn't be quantified. Emma's grades had improved, but more importantly, she laughed again, real laughter that came from genuine joy rather than obligation. David had joined the soccer team and made friends. but he had also begun talking about the future with excitement rather than anxiety. The house felt alive again, not just with the sounds of daily activity but with the sense that the people who lived there were truly living, not just existing. "Maria," James said as she gathered her things, "I want to talk to you about something, about the future." She turned to give him her full attention, and James was struck by how much their relationship had evolved. No longer was she the humble employee deferring to his authority. She was his partner in rebuilding his family's emotional life, someone whose insights were as valuable as any financial advisor's recommendations. "Emma will be applying to colleges soon," James continued. "And David is growing up so fast. They're going to need someone who understands them, who can stay connected with them as they become adults. I'm hoping you might consider being more than just our housekeeper." Maria tilted her head, understanding that James was working up to something important, but not quite sure what he was proposing. "I want to offer you a permanent position as our family coordinator," James said, the title coming out awkwardly because he was inventing it as he spoke. "Someone who helps manage not just the house but the emotional well-being of everyone in it. The salary would be significant, enough to buy a house, to have security, to never worry about whether you can afford bus fare or medical bills." The offer was generous, beyond anything Maria had ever imagined. Financial security, the respect of a professional title, integration into a family that had come to depend on her wisdom and care. It was the kind of opportunity that could transform her life completely. But Maria had learned, through years of cleaning other people's homes and caring for other people's families, that the most important decisions weren't about money. They were about dignity, about purpose, about the kind of person you wanted to be in the world. "That's very generous, Signor Harrison," she said carefully, "but I need to think about what that would mean." James nodded, understanding that he was asking her to leave behind not just a job, but an entire community, a way of life that had shaped her into the person he now valued so highly. Maria's strength came partially from her roots in the Mission District, from her connection to neighbors who understood struggle, from her church community that provided support in ways that money couldn't replicate. "Take your time," James said. "Just know that whatever you decide, you're family to us now. That doesn't change based on employment status or job titles." As Maria walked to the bus stop that evening, San Francisco spread out around her in all its complexity. From the elegant heights of Pacific Heights, she could see down into the neighborhoods where working families like her own made their lives. The Mission, Castro, Chinatown, all the communities that gave the city its character and vibrancy. The Harrison Mansion represented one kind of success, but the bustling streets below represented another. The success of people who built lives of meaning without necessarily building lives of wealth. Over the next few weeks, Maria found herself thinking about James's offer at unexpected moments. While she cleaned apartments in Noe Valley, she imagined what it would be like to focus on just one family, to have the resources to really make a difference in their daily lives. While she rode the bus home from work each evening, she considered what it would mean to own a car, to live in a larger space, to have the kind of financial security that lets you plan for the future rather than just survive the present. But she also thought about Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who relied on Maria to translate documents from her immigration lawyer. She thought about the little girl in apartment 3B who always ran to hug Maria's legs when she came home from work. She thought about her church community where she sang in the choir and helped serve meals to homeless families on Sunday afternoons. The question wasn't whether the Harrison family needed her. Clearly they did. The question was whether accepting their offer would require her to become someone different than who she had struggled to become. Maria Santos had been shaped by community, by shared struggle, by the understanding that everyone has something to offer and everyone needs support sometimes. Could she maintain that perspective while living in the rarefied world of Pacific Heights? The answer came to her on a Sunday afternoon when Emma showed up at her apartment building, looking nervous but determined. "I hope it's okay that I'm here," Emma said when Maria opened her door. "Dad gave me your address and I took the bus." Maria was touched by the gesture. James Harrison's daughter, who could have taken an Uber or been driven by the family's service, had chosen to navigate public transportation to visit her. It suggested a level of respect and effort that meant more than expensive gifts. "Of course it's okay, mija," Maria said, inviting Emma inside. "Would you like some coffee? I was just making some." Emma accepted gratefully, looking around Maria's small apartment with genuine interest, rather than the judgment Maria might have expected from someone raised in luxury. The space was modest but warm. Family photographs grouped on every surface, religious candles providing gentle light, furniture that had been chosen for comfort and durability rather than style. "It feels like home," Emma said simply. They settled on Maria's small sofa, coffee cups warming their hands, and for a few minutes just enjoyed the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the months of shared grief and gradual healing. "I wanted to talk to you about Dad's offer," Emma said finally. "Not to convince you one way or another, but to tell you what it would mean to our family if you said yes." Maria nodded, encouraging Emma to continue. "When Mom died, I thought our family died too," Emma began, her voice steady but emotional. "Dad disappeared into his work. David stopped talking, and I got so angry I couldn't see anything but how unfair everything was. We lived in the same house, but we weren't really living together, you know." "I know," Maria said softly. "But when you came, things started changing. Not because you replaced Mom. Nobody could do that. But because you showed us how to take care of each other again. You reminded us that we could still be a family, just a different kind of family than we were before." Emma paused, looking out the window at the Mission District street scene. Children playing on the sidewalk, neighbors greeting each other, the easy interaction of people who formed community through daily contact. "I'm going to college next year," Emma continued. "And I'm scared that without you there to hold us together, we'll fall apart again. Dad tries, but he doesn't have your instincts. He doesn't know when David needs extra attention or when I'm having a bad day about Mom. He loves us, but you understand us." The confession was vulnerable and honest, coming from a young woman who had learned to articulate her needs without being demanding, who could express love without manipulation. Emma had grown tremendously over the past months, but she was still 17 years old, still needing the security of knowing the adults in her life were stable and connected. "What do you want me to do?" Maria asked gently. "I want you to say yes, but only if it's what you want too," Emma replied. "Not because you feel sorry for us or because the money is good, but because you want to be part of our family for real. Because David needs someone who will listen to his soccer stories and help him with Spanish homework. Because Dad needs someone who will tell him when he's working too much and remind him to eat dinner. Because I need someone who knew my mom wasn't perfect but loved her anyway. Who can help me figure out how to honor her memory while still building my own life." The honesty in Emma's voice, the maturity of her request, touched something deep in Maria's heart. This 17-year-old girl had articulated what her father couldn't quite express. They weren't just offering Maria a job, they were offering her the chance to help shape the next generation of their family. Emma would go to college. David would grow into a young man. James would eventually find his way back to full engagement with life. But the foundation they built together over the next few years would determine what kind of adults Emma and David became, what kind of father James could be as his children matured. "Let me ask you something, mija," Maria said. "What kind of person do you want to become?" Emma considered the question seriously, understanding that Maria was asking something important about values and character, not just career goals or life plans. "I want to be someone who can hold sadness and joy at the same time," Emma said finally. "Someone who doesn't run away from hard things but doesn't let hard things make me hard. Someone who can take care of other people without losing myself, like you." The compliment was simple but powerful, recognition that Emma had been watching and learning, that Maria's influence had already begun shaping the young woman's understanding of what it meant to live with purpose and integrity. "And I want David to know that men can be gentle and strong at the same time," Emma continued. that having feelings doesn't make you weak, that taking care of your family is just as important as making money. I want Dad to remember that success isn't just about what you accumulate. It's about what you give. These were lessons that couldn't be taught in classrooms or boardrooms, insights that could only be learned through relationship and example. Maria realized that Emma was asking her not just to work for their family, but to help raise them, to be the person who modeled emotional wisdom while James provided financial security and intellectual challenge. That evening, as Emma prepared to return to Pacific Heights, Maria walked her to the bus stop on 24th Street. The Mission buzzed around them with the energy of working families, parents pushing strollers, teenagers playing music from small speakers, elderly people sitting on stoops and watching the world go by. This was Maria's community, the place where she was known and valued not for the services she could provide, but for who she was as a neighbor and friend. "I'm going to say yes to your father's offer," Maria told Emma as they waited for the bus. "But with conditions." Emma's face lit up with relief and excitement. "I want to keep my apartment here," Maria continued. "This neighborhood is part of who I am, and the Harrison family needs me to stay who I am. I'll live with you during the week, but weekends I come home to the Mission. I need to maintain my connections here, continue volunteering at the church, stay involved in my community." "Of course," Emma said immediately. "That makes perfect sense. And I want David and you to spend time here sometimes too. Not as charity or cultural education, but because this community has things to teach you about resilience, about finding joy without having everything, about the kind of support that comes from shared struggle." Emma nodded eagerly, understanding that Maria was offering to bridge two worlds, to bring the emotional intelligence of her working-class community into their privileged environment, while also exposing them to perspectives they couldn't gain from their elevated social position. The bus arrived, and as Emma prepared to board, she turned back to Maria with an expression of gratitude so profound it made Maria's eyes well with tears. "Thank you," Emma said simply, "for everything, for coming back, for helping us heal, for choosing to stay." As the bus pulled away with Emma visible through the back window, Maria felt the satisfaction that comes with making decisions based on love rather than fear, purpose rather than just profit. James Harrison had offered her financial security, but Emma had offered her something more valuable, the chance to help shape young lives during their most formative years, to be part of building something meaningful that would last long after job titles and salary amounts had been forgotten. 2 months later, Maria moved some of her belongings into a beautifully appointed suite on the 3rd floor of the Harrison mansion. Not servants' quarters, but a genuine guest suite with its own sitting area, full bathroom, and windows that looked out over the Golden Gate Bridge. James had insisted she decorate it however she wanted, and Maria had filled it with family photographs, plants that reminded her of her grandmother's garden, and books in both English and Spanish. But her real home remained the small apartment in the Mission District, where she returned every Friday evening and stayed until Monday morning. The rhythm worked perfectly, giving the Harrison family the stability of her consistent presence while preserving Maria's connection to the community that had shaped her values and perspective. The transformation was remarkable. David blossomed under Maria's patient attention, discovering that he had inherited both his father's analytical mind and his mother's artistic sensibilities. Maria encouraged him to explore both, helping him see that intelligence could be expressed through music and poetry, as well as mathematics and technology. His Spanish improved dramatically through daily conversations with Maria, and he began to take pride in being bilingual, understanding that speaking multiple languages was a gift rather than a burden. Emma thrived with the security of having a maternal figure who could provide both emotional support and practical guidance. As college applications loomed, Maria helped her think through not just where she wanted to go to school, but who she wanted to become. Together, they visited universities that emphasized service learning and social justice, institutions that would challenge Emma's intellect, while also nurturing her growing understanding of her responsibility to use her privileges for greater good. James underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. With Maria managing the emotional well-being of his family, he was able to engage with his children from a place of strength rather than desperation. His business decisions improved, not because he was working more hours, but because he was working with greater clarity and purpose. His company developed new cryptocurrency platforms that emphasized security and accessibility rather than just profit maximization. Innovations that reflected his growing understanding that technology should serve human flourishing rather than just financial accumulation. Most importantly, the house itself had been restored to life. Meals were shared around the kitchen island most evenings, with conversation flowing between English and Spanish as David practiced his language skills. Music filled the rooms again, Emma's piano practice, David's guitar experiments, and Maria's gentle singing while she worked. The formal living room was actually used, becoming a space where the family gathered for games and movie nights and the kinds of casual interactions that build intimacy over time. On a warm Sunday evening in late spring, as San Francisco enjoyed one of those perfect days when the fog lifts and the city sparkles like a promise fulfilled, the Harrison family gathered in their garden for a barbecue. James manned the grill with the focused intensity he had once brought to cryptocurrency trading, while David and Emma set up a small speaker system and argued good-naturedly about playlist choices. Maria sat at the patio table, shelling peas for a salad, and watching the family she had helped rebuild. They were different people than they had been a year ago. David more confident, Emma more compassionate, James more present. But more than individual growth, they had learned to function as a unit again, to support and challenge each other, to share both burdens and joys. "Maria," James said, taking a break from the grill, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from the peas, giving him her full attention in the way that had become characteristic of their relationship. "Last week I got a call from Catherine's sister," James continued. "She wanted to thank me for whatever changes I had made because Emma and David seem so much healthier when she talks to them. She said they sound like themselves again, but stronger." The compliment was meaningful because Catherine's sister had been one of the family members who had worried most about the children's emotional well-being in the months after the accident. Her recognition of their improvement represented outside validation of the healing that had been occurring within the family. "She also said something else," James added. "She said Catherine would be proud of the man I'm becoming, of the father I'm learning to be." Maria felt tears prick her eyes at the profound nature of this gift. Catherine Harrison would never see her children graduate from high school, would never attend their college graduations or weddings, would never hold her grandchildren. But through Maria's patient work and James's willingness to change, Catherine's influence continued to shape her family's values and priorities. "Your wife raised good children," Maria said softly. "They just needed time and support to remember who they were meant to be." As the evening progressed and they shared a meal that had been prepared with love and attention, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A year ago she had been just another domestic worker, invisible to most of the people whose homes she cleaned, struggling to make ends meet while maintaining dignity in the face of economic uncertainty. Now she was an integral part of a family's healing, someone whose insights were valued and whose presence was cherished. But more than that, she had learned that her experiences, the losses she had endured, the struggles she had survived, the wisdom she had gained through hardship, were not just personal history, but gifts she could offer to others navigating their own difficult passages. The house on Pacific Heights had been transformed not through expensive renovations or professional intervention, but through the patient application of love, attention, and faith in people's capacity to grow. Maria had brought to the Harrison family what her own community had taught her: that healing happens through relationship, that strength is built through supporting others, that the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be calculated in portfolios or measured in market returns. As they sat together watching the sunset over San Francisco Bay, James raised his glass of wine, not the expensive bottles he used to drink alone in his study, but a modest vintage that Maria had recommended from a shop in the Mission District. "To family," he said simply. To family, Emma and David echoed, raising their own glasses of sparkling water. To all the different ways love shows up in our lives, Maria added, thinking of Catherine's continued presence in their daily interactions, of Rosa's influence on her own capacity for compassion, of all the people who had shaped them into who they were becoming, and somewhere in the gentle clinking of glasses, in the comfortable conversation that followed, in the easy laughter that filled spaces once haunted by grief, the true transformation was complete. Not because pain had been eliminated, Catherine's absence would always be felt, Rosa's loss would always ache, but because love had been allowed to expand rather than contract in the face of loss. The Richardson mansion stood as elegant as ever against the San Francisco skyline, its market value continuing to appreciate as Pacific Heights remained one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. But its real value now couldn't be measured in dollars or stock options or cryptocurrency holdings. Its value lay in the laughter that echoed through its rooms, the family dinners that brought together people from different worlds around the same table, the understanding that wealth means nothing without the wisdom to use it in service of connection and growth. Maria Santos had started as a maid and become a teacher, a healer, a bridge between worlds that rarely touched. She had shown a grieving family that healing was possible, that love could survive loss, that the most important riches were the ones that accumulated in hearts rather than bank accounts. As the evening deepened and they moved inside the warm house, each person carrying dishes and continuing conversations that would extend into the coming week, Maria felt the deep satisfaction of work completed not just competently, but with love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. David had a difficult math test. Emma was stressing about college essays. James had a board meeting that would determine the future of several investment opportunities. But they would face these challenges together, as a family that had learned to trust each other's strengths and support each other's vulnerabilities. In a city built on gold rush dreams and technological innovation, where fortunes were made and lost on the fluctuations of markets and the whims of venture capital, the Harrison family had discovered something more stable and more valuable. The understanding that the richest life is one lived in genuine connection with others, where individual success serves collective flourishing, where the accumulation of love matters more than any other kind of wealth. And you? Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you been in a home where your presence brought healing, even when that wasn't officially part of your job description? Tell me your story in the comments below. Because every person who has maintained dignity in the face of injustice, who has offered compassion when it wasn't required, who has continued to love even when love seemed risky, every person like that is a teacher, whether they realize it or not. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own capacity for strength and grace, please leave a like and subscribe so it can reach another woman who needs hope today. Share it with someone who has cleaned houses or cared for children or tended to other people's needs while their own contributions went unrecognized. For more stories about the quiet heroes who hold families together, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us, for opening your heart to Maria and the Harrison family, for understanding that the most important transformations happen not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the daily choices we make to see each other's humanity. We'll see you in our next story, where we'll explore another chapter in the endless book of human resilience and love.